Welcome to today's Hinckley Forum. My name is Anika Rao, and I am a student forum host here at the Hinckley Institute. The Hinckley Institute of Politics is a nonpartisan institute at the University of Utah. The Hinckley provides an array of transformative experiences for students through internships, forums, and classes. Hinckley forums seek to foster public discourse and civil debate on the most current and pressing issues, bringing in local, national, and international thought leaders. A quick note that pizza will be here at the end of today's forum, just outside. Today's forum is titled Student Pulse, the Utah Priorities Project, and we are excited to partner with the Utah Foundation for this event. We will be joined by Sean Teagan, who's the president of the Utah Foundation. He has worked for the Utah Foundation for over a decade, researching a broad swath of public policy issues. He also teaches a public policy course at the University of Utah. Sean has worked as a housing policy analyst, a consultant to early-stage businesses, and a founder of an organization focused on foreign investment-related economic development. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in management and a Master of Public Policy degree from the University of Utah, and he serves as a board member for several public sector, private sector, and nonprofit organizations. Sean has always been active in volunteering, including having spent 2 years in Kazakhstan with the U.S. Peace Corps. Please join me in welcoming our guest.
Hey, thank you so much. Who in here has heard of the Utah Foundation, other than just a moment ago? A few of you. Okay, great. We're a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy research organization. Our mission is to help inform and engage Utahns with illuminating, that's where we get our logo from, illuminating nonpartisan public policy, independent research. We are an independent organization. While we get funding from people to do our work, which is important, we have no major one large funding source. So we can the way I like to say it is we can get in trouble with certain people and we can still stick around because other people then are like, oh yeah, these guys are all right, because then now they're finally saying something that we like to say. We tend to make people mad with almost everything we do, but then we make them happy with the next thing we do. We are out on this student pulse. We're getting around the state, talking to people in a whole host of different places, mostly in universities, to talk about the Utah Priorities Project. We got a little support from Union Pacific for this tour, and then the system of higher education, of which the U is one. We worked a little bit with them they helped us get around and talk to people about this. We've been around, the Utah Foundation has been around for 80 years. We've been doing this Utah Priorities Project for 20 years. We basically administer some surveys every gubernatorial election year, and then we do a bunch of research based upon those surveys. So, and it's all about priorities, almost all about priorities. In addition to priorities, we ask a bunch of questions that are related to what those priorities are. We also have some initial questions, and I'm going to start off by asking you all a question. If you're online, you can get this QR code off your screen, or get your QR code here, and take a little survey to let me know if you think that Utah is on the wrong track, or if Utah is headed in the right direction. Is Utah on the wrong track, or is Utah headed in the right direction? So Nika mentioned I've taught a class up here. I didn't teach one this year, but my students are always confused by the fact that I don't let them use their computers or phones in class. It's like we go back into the 20th century with notepads and pens, and then I ask you on one of my first slides to pull out your phones and answer a question. But this is an easy way to do it. Slido's pretty cool in this way. Slido did not, I gave a pitch for them. They're not participating in helping us get around the state to talk about the Utah Priorities Project. But so let's go from here. It looks like the people that answered this survey feel like Utah's on the wrong track. So it's just funny because I didn't think you'd answer this way. We've asked this question now. I think I've gone around and talked to, 8 groups so far, and it's basically flipped. Almost everybody everywhere else has said that Utah is headed in the right direction at about 60% and headed in the wrong direction at about 40%. You all in here mirror the state of Utah? We asked this question of the state of Utah, and we see way over here in 2024 that about 60% of people, actually 61, said we're on the wrong track, and 39 said we're headed in the right direction. That's the first time since we started administering this survey way back 20 years ago, using this question, that was anywhere near. I mean, this is the first time that there's more people that feel like Utah is headed is on the wrong track, which is interesting. Can somebody tell me, like, why? Like, somebody that said we're headed in the right direction. Why are we headed in the right direction? What's going on? Like, and this is just kind of a general feeling about the state, but who said we're headed in the right direction? Anybody? Yeah.
I think the younger voters are more active than ever. I also think that we are also getting great funding for transportation, and one of my major things is transportation, and I think transportation is getting pretty good interest among people, and I think we're heading in the right direction that way, but that's it.
Yeah. Transportation. Actually, so one of the things that I talk about, and I've talked about this several times to several groups, is in terms of transportation, Utah very recently, the legislature passed an initiative of the governor and the Utah Department of Transportation for funding for trails. We've got this trail network that is going to get an enormous amount of funding. They already received an initial amount, I think, of $45 million, but this enormous amount of money. Every year, it's ongoing funding that is going to, this is one thing. It's trails. And I ride my bike all over the place. I rode my bike up here, which is why I'm all sweaty. But I feel like in 30 years from now, we're going to look back and at that funding change and be like, oh my goodness, that transformed this one aspect of the state. It's going to be, I think it'll be a big deal. What about the wrong direction? What's going on? Wrong track.
Well, I think the state legislature isn't really doing enough to combat climate change, like, for example, the Great Salt Lake drying up.
Yeah. Okay, great. Great Salt Lake, it's a big deal. And we're going to talk about that here in just a little bit when we talk a little bit more about the priorities. Any other thoughts about the wrong track? Yeah.
I was just going to say, like, I agree. I feel like especially with the lake and some of our other natural resources, we're just kind of mishandling it. And not enough legislation is being focused on what we're doing with, like, oil reserves and the Salt Lake and things like that. And I feel like the focus should be shifted towards that. So.
Yeah. So super concerned about the Great Salt Lake. I'm concerned about Great Salt Lake. I think about it all the time. I am not, so we're totally nonpartisan, but I just gave a plug to the legislature, and the governor did this great thing. The Great Salt Lake, I mean, there has been some amazing things that have taken place in terms of water rights since 2019 that are transformative, but are they transformative enough? And it doesn't focus on climate change. It just focuses on water, on one body of water, well, and potentially some others. But they're doing some things. But is it enough? And is it enough of the things that matter to people, like climate change? And we'll talk more about climate change just a little bit. We also have a slide here where we talk about quality of life. And one of the things the Utah Priorities Project is one of our signature products. We also do this big quality of life project that is pretty awesome, but we also have a quality of life question in the survey. And we ask people, compared to 5 years ago, how is your quality of life? In 2024, again, 61% people say it's much worse or somewhat worse. 12% say it's much better, somewhat better, and about just under a third of us say it's the same. This is so freaking befuddling to me because when you look at this graph, you see, I mean, it goes back and forth, quality of life compared to 5 years ago. Here's quality of life at the Great Recession. About 46% of people said during the Great Recession, I don't know how many of you remember the Great Recession, but it was kind of scary. Like, people were freaked out about stuff. It was kind of a scary thing. 56% of the people said their quality of life was bad. During the early pandemic, people were like, yeah, I don't know. It's maybe it's a little worse than it was 5 years ago. I actually think it was kind of cool. Like, I mean, the pandemic, obvious, COVID freaking terrible, obviously. But a kid that was stuck in my house all the time, and we ate lunch every day. It was freaking awesome. That part of it was awesome. All of the deaths, all of the other pandemonium was terrible. But this is interesting, but then like it jumps up. People are feeling really freaking gloomy right now about stuff. Their quality of life, they say we're on the wrong track, and our quality of life isn't as good as it was 5 years ago. Interesting stuff. I think we try to think about this. I think it probably has to do with especially for young people. I hear this a lot. This existential threat about climate change and whatnot. And we actually talked about this issue at the Salt Lake Library just a couple nights ago. Was that last night? 2 nights ago, something. So I mentioned that we've got a couple of surveys as part of this Utah Priorities Project. So we have 2 surveys. Our first one is a fishing poll, which we name as a fishing poll because that's funny, but also because we're fishing for answers. It's basically, this is very simple. We ask 2 open-ended questions. We say, what's something that you're concerned about that the state government and other elected officials can do something about? And then we ask them another thing, what's the second thing that you can think of that you're concerned about? What are your 2 top issues, effectively, that people can think about, that the government can do something about? And then we take those data. I shouldn't probably say this because we have an intern here from the Utah Foundation, but we utilize interns to help us sort data because it's such a pain in the butt. Like, who wants to do this? And so we got interns that sort all these data. We sorted them out into 51 bins, and with those 51 bins, we take the top 17, or this time we did. These 51 bins are kind of depending on what the data are. We then take the top 17 this time around because the number of people that answered something like the 17th question and the 18th question was a big drop off, and so we said, okay, we'll use 17, and then we'll ask people with another survey about their priorities. We ask people about quality of life and right direction, and then we ask a bunch of priorities questions. What we do with that, we analyze those data, and we do. If anybody in here do like in statistics or anything, do you take some anybody? Have you guys heard of something called maximum difference analysis? So you basically take all these data. You can't organize 17 things cognitively in your brain or even on a piece of paper from 1 to 17. It's just too hard. So we ask people, what's the most important of these, concerning of these 4 things, and what's the least important? And then we ask that a bunch of times, and then we do a whole bunch of inferential statistics to figure out kind of where people are and where the state is. And then we release a report. And we released this report right here that I've blocked out because I don't want you to know what the report is titled, because I have another question for you. And that question has to do with your priorities. I want to know, in terms of some priorities here on the board, like air quality and K-12 education, and politicians not listening to voters and partisan politics, having enough water, governmental overreach, housing affordability, and earning enough to pay for non-housing needs. I want to know where you feel. So there's a couple of environmentally kind of directed questions here. There's air quality and water. There's some governmental kind of political stuff, like government overreach and politicians not listening to voters and partisan politics. And then we've got some things related to costs, like housing affordability and earning enough to pay for non-housing needs at the bottom. And then finally, right in the middle there, almost in the middle, we've got K-12 education. So I've got another question for you here. With this one, which of the following issues are most concerning right now for you? And just choose like 3 or 4. Just choose 3 or 4 issues that are kind of top of the list for you. What concerns you? All right. I shouldn't show the slide because it could influence your choices. You're either going to feel bad for, I don't know, water or something. Is water? Where is water on there? Yeah, it's up at the bottom. Or else you'll be like, oh yeah, housing affordability. Oh yeah, politicians not listening to voters. All right, this is awesome. Housing affordability. How many of you in here own a house? Do you think that this issue is more important to people that don't own houses or people that own houses? Yeah,
Don't own houses?
that don't own houses. Why?
Because they want to own a house?
You want to own a house, and you're stuck in like rent land, and you're paying rent that increases, and it's like you look around, and it's like 2 years ago I thought I could get a place for $500, and now I can't get a place for $1,000. So yeah, housing affordability particularly concerning. You in this way, you look like students at institutions of higher ed around the state. In terms of housing affordability. What I like about your answers here is that when you think about, so housing affordability, politicians not listening to voters, and then we've got air quality, K-12 education, government overreach a little bit. When you think about the issues that are most important to people around the state, the top one is housing affordability. The second one is politicians not listening to voters. We took this survey, we administered this survey back in March. We've completed it like March 20th or something. People are probably not quite as concerned about earning enough to pay for non-housing needs as they used to be. This stuff is still as expensive, but it's not going up as quickly in cost as it was. Maybe not in March, but still a little bit in March, but particularly in the months preceding that. But then we've got government overreach, partisan politics, air quality for you guys was third. And here it's third, well, tied with K-12 education. Those two are at the bottom, kindergarten through 12th grade education, air quality are at the bottom of this list. You also look like students at other institutions of higher ed in terms of prioritizing kindergarten through 12th grade education. I mean, that's an issue that you know about because you are experts in it, because you were in school in K-12 education a lot more recently than I was, or my spouse, or my friends. Not that I don't have any young friends. I've got some young friends too. But air quality, however, when you get off the Wasatch Front, air quality isn't prioritized very highly. Like you guys have it in tied for third for this small sample size. It's not as big of a deal off the Wasatch Front for a whole bunch of for apparent reasons. So we released this first report, and with this report, we title it "Priced Out and Fed Up: Cost of Living and Political Dysfunction Are Voters' Top Issues." Those cost of living is it's cost of stuff and housing. Political dysfunction is governmental overreach. It is partisan politics. It is politicians not listening to them. This is like really edgy. So when you're a public, it's kind of a nerdy public policy, like, well, we're going to study stuff and then release a report on it. Often, when I was like, I got like nervous about releasing a report that had like an edgy title to it for some reason. I don't know why that is. But it is. I mean, it's edgy because it's apparent. People are concerned about. They're fed up. They're fed up and they're priced out. People are concerned about, we've written a lot on politicians not listening to voters. There's I think, a valid reason why people are angry about that issue. So we've got this list that are the top 8 issues, and these are we kind of bin them into these 4 different categories. Like I said, air quality and K-12 education are at the bottom of the list here, but that doesn't mean they're not important. It means that they're the 7th and 8th roughly most important thing out of 51 issues that were initially brought up by people. So there's a lot of issues on this list, and when you look at the whole list, you see other things like taxes and immigration and homelessness and crime and abortion and crowded neighborhoods, and you can't see these at the bottom very well, but Great Salt Lake, transgender rights and access. Great Salt Lake is at the bottom, near the bottom of this list. So it's still important to people. It's at the bottom of this list. A lot of people brought it up in that open-ended question survey poll. But perhaps when you prioritize it against other things, people might say, well, water generally, the Great Salt Lake is certainly a concern, but what about the Colorado River? Why is that not broken out? The only reason why it's broken out like this is because when people brought up the Great Salt Lake, they didn't say the Great Salt Lake and drought issues, the Great Salt Lake and water. They said the Great Salt Lake. And when people brought up water and drought, they didn't say anything about the Great Salt Lake. They said water and drought. It was kind of interesting to see. So we were like, I guess we break those up into 2. If you combine them together, it becomes more important. That's one of the issues with kind of survey methodology. This is the methodology we've been stuck with for 20 years, and I think it's pretty good, but there are some tricks about it and some nuances and some caveats to some of the ordering of some of these things. But this is the main list. So not everybody feels the same way about those. Oh, and I should mention, like, this isn't numbered 1 to 17. We categorize them in most important, high importance. Why is that? Why do we say most important instead of number 1, number 2?
Well, there's no way to like actually give like an actual rating to certain things. So saying it's most important tries to capture a bigger audience than saying it's the number one reason, which would push people out of the category.
Yeah, I think that's part of it. The other part is that statistically significant differences. There's a lot of overlap between 1 and 2. So we kind of feel housing affordability is, pretty likely number 1. But there's a chance that actually politicians listening to voters is number 2. There's some gaps here, like very clearly Great Salt Lake and transgender rights and access are at the bottom of the list. Like we break it up so you can see kind of the differences, but there's a lot of overlap, particularly in this medium importance. So it's like immigration, homelessness, crime. I don't know, like. That's where they are. They're medium importance to people, but we're not going to say it's like 10th and 11th and 12th or whatever. We do say that sometimes by accident, and we have to like, why do we keep using those numbers? We should just remember it's medium importance. When we look at these data, we look at a lot of demographic data as well. We collect demographic data so we can analyze some of this stuff, and we found that after accounting for other demographic factors, older voters tend to prioritize things like abortions, women's rights, air quality, partisan politics, politicians, listening to voters. So that's more common for older voters than younger voters. This is after accounting for all these other demographic factors. So it may be that for, typically we think that maybe older voters are more conservative, maybe older voters are a little bit more engaged in politics, or maybe vote more. I mean, they vote more, they're more likely to vote. And air quality. Why would air quality be a big issue for older voters, do you think? Yeah.
Maybe their lungs just don't work as well anymore.
Yeah, totally. My dad doesn't care about air quality until he began to care about air quality when he was diagnosed with COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disorder. And then he's like, air quality is bad today. You better be careful, Sean. I'm like, oh, whatever, Dad, you weirdo. Like in the past, he was like, out there smoking and driving a big old stinky Ford around. I was like, whatever. Priorities change, I guess, when circumstances change. For younger voters, and possibly with abortion and women's rights, that may be an issue more for older voters, and we actually have a little bit of evidence to suggest this, because for concern around, they may be a little bit more conservative, so you've got potentially a little bit more concern around abortion. That was phrased terribly. You might be more opposed to abortion as a conservative voter. Younger voters earning enough to pay for non-housing needs, housing affordability, K-12 education. So recency of K-12 education and paying for stuff. Stuff is expensive. It's crazy expensive. I lived right down the hill on Elizabeth Street, and I had a 2-bedroom apartment, and it cost me $250 a month. It's freaking awesome. So, and I didn't have roommates. Who needs roommates? It's $250 a month. I shouldn't be bragging. That was a long time ago. Now I've got less square footage than I had when I was 19. So younger voters, this is kind of curious. You do see that abortion and women's rights shows up as number 9 here. This is not after accounting for other demographic factors. So we weight all these data so that we make sure that the data look like the people are on the state. So so this is a little bit different, but younger voters, you see K-12 education up there, housing at the top, ignoring voters, inflation. I mean, like I said, take this with a little bit of a grain of salt, because as I said, this is not when you account for other factors. But homelessness made the list, and there's a reason why. I'll actually talk about this coloration here in just a second. When we look at these demographic factors, the thing that younger people and older people. We've got race and ethnicity. We've got gender. What else do we have? A bunch of other stuff. But the things that are that you see the most difference in, it's what? Party affiliation and ideology. So you see the most difference in party affiliation and ideology, and we don't ask people's ideology, and I'll get to that in a minute. We figure out what their ideology is by asking some ideologically polarized questions. But it's so like if you break it down, it's party affiliation. I mean, there's a big difference between Democrats and Republicans. When you look at Democrats, women's rights, abortion and women's rights is at the top of the list. You've got partisanship, air quality that are up there a little ways. When you look at Republicans, at the top, closer to the top of the list, you've got immigration. Immigration is up there that you wouldn't see, that you don't see on the Democrat side. So there's a little bit of difference here when you look across parties. There's a ton of unaffiliated voters in Utah. What this figure is showing is that the yellow things in the middle, the yellow cells, you see it in two different places. So partisanship and air quality are on the Democrat side. Those are also in unaffiliated. Inflation, immigration, taxes on the Republican side, they're also unaffiliated. For Democrats, what's unique to them is women's rights, homelessness in Great Salt Lake. What's unique to Republicans is crime and roads and transportation. So you see these differences, and like I said, they're by far the most. That's the biggest difference you're going to find across groups, and it's very consistent. There's almost no difference between men and women. There's almost no difference between races and ethnicities. Religiosity, you do find differences across religions. We've got like non-religious, you've got actively religious, inactively religious. There's a big difference between people that are religious and non-religious. The religious people tend to look more like conservatives and Republicans. The non-religious tend to look more like Democrats and liberals. But you see these differences here. The coolest thing about this, when I found that I sometimes, like, I'm jealous because I have people I work with that do all this cool research, and I have to like go fundraise and stuff. But sometimes I get to dig into the research a little bit as well, and I'm so proud of myself that I found this fact here that when you're looking at unaffiliated voters, this column in the middle, unaffiliated voters, in order, look exactly like Utahns. Utahns and unaffiliated voters are the same. People might think, oh, it's a red state. It's a red state. Everybody feels like this way about, like, they feel like conservatives. In terms of priorities, unaffiliated folks look like Utahns, and in terms of beyond the priorities to some of the details underneath those priorities, unaffiliated voters tend to look like Utahns generally, which I think is pretty interesting. Was I clear there? Does that make sense? Yeah, I got some nods. Okay, good. I got a thumbs up. I'm going for it. Speaking of political affiliation, so when you look back at 2020, in terms of statewide voters, this is a pretty red state. So we got 61% of voters are Republicans in 2020, 35% are Democrats, and then we've got some unaffiliated and third-party voters. When you look at registered voters, there's fewer Republicans, fewer Democrats, and then a lot of unaffiliated folks. And then that third-party thing is so funny. People register as the Utah Independent Party, which is not independent or unaffiliated. It's just a party. It's just a different party than the other parties. I want to write a report on that to be like big reveal, voters. You're not unaffiliated. You belong to a party that may or may not have a platform that agrees with you at all, which I think is kind of interesting. Lastly, when you think about people and how they identify, a plurality of people, I shouldn't say most, I shouldn't say plurality, apparently. A plurality of people are unaffiliated. You got over a third that are Republicans, and then about a fifth that are Democrats. So there's some big differences here. I think it's kind of interesting when you look at voters and the votes, and we'll see for 2024 how that compares with registered voters and self-identified voters. You also see in terms of registered voters, some Democrats maybe registered as Republicans, even though they're Democrats. Some Republicans may be registered as, well, like Republicans in heart may be registered as unaffiliated for various reasons. You see that with Democrats too. But a lot of people feel like they feel like, yeah, when I think about what's in my heart, a lot of Utahns, a plurality of Utahns are unaffiliated, which I think is kind of an interesting thing. And ergo, that list in the middle there, looking like Utahns in general in many ways. I think that's all pretty fascinating. So that's the big first report. Another report we released was, that first one is that edgy title about being priced out and fed up. This one we're trying to be like nicer. This is the nice version where it's like, hey, issues that unite and divide Utah voters, bridging gaps. So we're all about bridging gaps in the second report. This delves into partisanship and ideology, and we want to look at how people feel about issues, and we wanted to focus mostly on issues that unite, but it's like, I mean, there are issues that you divide as well, and particularly when you scratch the surface on some of these united issues, and we'll talk about that in a second. So we've got this list of 17 issues here, and a few of these top issues, this is, most important, high importance, important. We got 4 of those first 8 issues. Those are issues that are actually pretty, they're not only important to people, but that people feel the same way about them generally. So K-12 education, having enough water, government overreach, and housing affordability are prioritized very similarly across parties. So you've got at the top here, K-12 education, it's indistinguishable, the Republicans, unaffiliated voters, and Democrats. You see water here, like the Democrats. You see a little bit higher priority on water, but really there's no statistically significant difference there. Same thing with overreach, government overreach. They feel a little bit less concerned, but there's really no difference. And even with housing, there's no difference. The interesting thing here is that if you remember back on the Democrats, that prioritization for Democrats, housing was way down the list. That's not because it's less important, because like I said, it's not statistically different. It's not because it's less important. It's because Democrats are really concerned about 5 other issues. They're not less concerned about the top issue for unaffiliated voters or for Republicans. They're just more concerned, even more concerned about these other issues, topping the list with abortion and women's rights. So very similar in these issues. You see that there's some other issues that are pretty similar. Homelessness, a little bit more of a concern for Democrats, but just barely. Roads and transportation, a little bit less of a concern, but just barely. And then you see unaffiliated voters and Democrats. It is statistically significant difference between unaffiliated voters and Democrats and Republicans. There's a difference there where perhaps it makes sense that Democrats and unaffiliated voters feel like politicians are listening to them, because when you look at the state, when you look at statewide office, when we look at the legislature, it's predominantly made up by Republicans. And so you might be like if they listen to Democrats, then other people would say, well, they're not listening to me. And so you're always going to have people that are kind of flustered in that respect. The things that have the big difference, it's Great Salt Lake. That's a big one. That may be because where do the Democrats live? By the lake. Immigration. Immigration is such a crazy, that there are issues that, anyway, I'm not going to get into that. There's a big spread there on immigration by political affiliation. There's a big spread on transgender rights and access. That issue right there, that will not be on this survey at the next gubernatorial election year, I guarantee it. The only reason why it's here is because they were talking about the legislature ad nauseum with some bills that made a lot of people mad, and that made other people like, why are you talking about this at all? What's going on? So it came up in the issue. Healthcare. Healthcare, I'm taking a tangent here, flowing off the screen into a little tangent. Healthcare was number one in 2020, in part because of COVID. Healthcare was number one in 2016, in large part because of Obamacare. It's not even on the list this time around. So few people. We got 2,000 responses from that fishing poll. Almost no one. Even old people, like, what's going on? Aren't you concerned about healthcare? Nobody's concerned about it right now. Everybody's concerned about so many other issues. There's stuff more important than healthcare to make the list. You brought up climate change earlier. Climate change is also not on the list. Didn't make the list. It's down like 25th out of those 51 issues. Though, kind of by proxy, you could suggest that the Great Salt Lake, having enough water other than Great Salt Lake, and then air quality. I mean, those are air quality related, like fires, wildfires, and potentially the Salt Lake and other things, that those are proxies for climate change. But it just wasn't prioritized. Like, that's not what people weren't bringing up that blanket statement. They were bringing up some of the specifics. Women's rights and abortion, very, like we said, very, very, very important for most Democrats. Top issue for most Democrats. A lot less important for most Republicans. And then I brought up a bit ago political affiliation. We don't ask people, like I said, if they're liberal, if they're conservative. We ask this selection of a whole bunch of questions to figure out where they are. But you just see overlap in these things. So water, housing. Water, for the most part, Republicans look like Democrats when they're thinking about water. When you think about housing, you would think that they're the same, but there's actually some differences. So I was talking about like scratching the difference a little bit. And I actually can't even remember what the slide is that I included, that I left in here. But when you think about housing, we ask people, what are you concerned about around housing? Are you concerned about housing for renters and low-income populations? Or are you concerned about housing for first-time homebuyers? So I think we actually only had 2 questions on that one. And housing for first-time homebuyers was more of a priority for Republicans, whereas housing for renters and low-income populations was a bit more of a priority for Democrats. But it's definitive, but it's not like, oh, absolutely, that all people are concerned about all of the things. We force people into some hard choices in this survey. Okay, so we have some policy proposals, and I think I left 2 slides in here. I cut a couple out just because it started getting a little bit long. So in terms of, we would ask people a question about whether they would do something. Would you do this thing? Are you extremely willing, very willing, all the way down to not at all willing? And when you look at, I'm willing to remove 50% of my lawn to allow it to go brown during summer months to reduce the cost of Utah's water infrastructure investments by 30%. So that's basically, we're reducing the cost of government, but we're also reducing our bills a little bit by letting our lawn go brown. And most people in the state are willing. There's 54%, these over on the right here. 54% of the people are willing to do that. Oh, I actually just love one slide in here. We also asked a question about, in fact, I think I meant to delete this one and include the other one. We also have a question about driving and air quality. Are you willing to drive less in order to incrementally improve air quality? We also asked a question about education. Are you willing to, and this one was a tough one. Most people are actually opposed to this, but are you willing to spend $500 of your own hard-earned money in order to see 10% more kids that are 3rd grade being able to read? So we asked people that question, but people are like, yeah, we want kids to be able to read, but I don't have $500 for it, for somebody else's kid. I'll send my own kid to a tutor or something. So we see differences there. Those questions also, Democrats are a little bit more willing to spend the money, and Democrats are a little bit more willing to drive less to improve air quality. I've just got a few more slides here, and then I've got another question. This one I think is so interesting. We I brought up these 10 questions. Who's heard of the Pew Research Center? Okay, a lot of people have heard about Pew. The Utah Foundation is a freaking think tank in Utah. You should know about the Utah Foundation. They are just as, Pew puts out a lot more stuff. They're slightly better, well-funded than the Utah Foundation is, and have, 40 times more employees. But they do the similar stuff that the Utah Foundation does. Back in 2012 or 2016, now I can't remember. I've been there so long, it's all one big blur. But we used Pew questions to understand the ideology of Republicans and Democrats and unaffiliated voters in Utah. We used Pew questions so that we could then compare Utah to people across the U.S. And these questions are basically like, do you agree with this statement or this statement? Do you agree with this thing that is a traditionally conservative idea, or this thing that's a traditionally liberal idea? And what you come up with is a scale from consistently liberal over here on the left to consistently conservative over here on the right. What you saw back in 1994 when Pew first did this cool survey, you found that there were two mountains, kind of like this red mountain here on the right. There were two mountains, and they were mostly overlapped. Most, like Democrats and Republicans in 1994, mostly looked the same in terms of the positions on these statements that are now, or even then, were more liberal and more conservative leaning statements, but most people across the U.S. were the same. Starting in 2002, those mountains started separating a bit. And now, and this is the Pew is so awesome. They changed the methodology for 2023. And they did it in a way that is amazing in its own right, but it makes it a little bit less easy to compare to previous years. But what you find is that the mountain for conservatives looks about the same. For Republicans, looks about the same. Like the median Republican is mixed kind of in their ideology, where you see that the median Democrat, the Democrats kind of shoved over to the left in this new methodology that they used. And you see that the median Democrat is mostly liberal. So you see Democrats are mostly liberal, Republicans are mostly mixed, but trending toward conservative. And the unaffiliated voters, this big kind of gap in this big mountain, the gray mountain in the middle that's a little hard to see, is a little bit left. So when you think about this, what does Utah look like? Does it make sense? Anybody have any questions on that one? Okay, it's a cool slide. Oh, the next slide's gonna be even cooler when I show both back to back. What about Utah? So how does Utah look compared to this group? And the question I'm going to ask you on this little Slido is, are Utahns more liberal than Americans? Or are Utahns a little more conservative than Americans? Or is it more of a mix? So maybe liberals are more conservative or more liberal, or unaffiliated or moved around in a different direction, and then conservative, and then Republicans moved around in a different direction. So the question is, what about Utah? Are Utahns more liberal, or are they just a mixture of the other ones, or are they more conservative? All right. Just like that, we jumped up to 17. 18. Yeah, mixed. Mixed is the safe answer, because it's like, well, why would all three median voters go in one direction? What the heck is the median? Does anybody know what's a median? It's the middle. It's just basically the middle voter. So if there's 101 there's three. Let's just say there's three. I don't know, 101 is 51. If there's three voters, the median is whoever the middle person is. It's not averaged one way or another. It makes sense that you would choose mixed because you've got three data points. It's like maybe we're more polarized, maybe we're less polarized. It's hard to say, but it's a good guess. Conservative, a third of you picked more conservative, and then 22% said more liberal. Turns out, big reveal, and the reason why I have this slide up here and ask this question is to show that you guys are all freaking wrong, or most of you are. They're more liberal. Utahns are more liberal than Americans at large. The median Republican is a bit more liberal, mainly because that mountain is a little bit more spread out. The median unaffiliated voter is mostly liberal. The median Democrat is like an uber Democrat. They are like super Democrats. Like when you ask a Democrat in Utah about these 10 issues, they're almost always going to say, yeah, I'm taking the liberal position. Whatever the liberal position is, they're going to go with it almost all the time. You see this gigantic mountain here. That's consistent. We've seen that in Utah for a long time. And why the heck? Why would Democrats in Utah be so Democrats? Like the power Democrats? Why is that? Yeah.
Because the state is more conservative, they kind of want to have more of a voice, and so they might try to be more radical.
Yeah, it's more, so they might try to be more radical. The state's more conservative. I'm showing here, though, that the median Republican is less conservative than the nation. What's that all about? I mean, it's because there are a lot of them, effectively. It's more conservative because there are a lot of them. There are a lot of Democrats. I mean, there are a lot of Republicans. A lot of people, not only registered Republicans, but that vote Republican. And then you've got this other group that is seen, and it may be beyond just partisanship. There may be factors related to, and we've looked into a tiny bit of this stuff in the past, factors related to, I mean, it's counterculture. It's like there's a religiosity kind of a pressure against that. There's a pressure that's like, we don't want to be like the prototypical Utahn. We want to be something else. I think there's a story, and somebody actually just told me they said this was fake, but it was about the number of breweries and coffee shops and tattoo parlors in Utah is like wildly out of proportion for the population. Not just in Salt Lake, but Salt Lake affects the rest of the state with so many. I mean, you can find tattoo shops in Provo, but somebody else I've never looked at those data myself. I think it was just anecdotal, and somebody said, no, that's true. That's all a bunch of bunkus. But you do see, Salt Lake looks different than, and I'm not saying Salt Lake Valley, I'm saying mostly just Salt Lake City, and a little bit of the surrounding community looks very different than perhaps the rest of the state does. The median Republican, this isn't because people are registered as Republicans, but then are actually Democrats. They just want to vote in the primary. The reason for that spread, I mean, because we ask people, we don't say, show us your ID. We don't say, what are you? Say, what do you affiliate with? What do you feel like? Do you feel like a Republican? Do you feel like a Democrat? Do you feel like you're unaffiliated? Just like Pule does. But you do see this big mix, and the thing we think about on this one, when we thought about this a little bit, is that perhaps, like my dad is a pretty strong Republican. And when I was younger, I was like, I guess I'm a Republican. I mean, he's a Republican. My mom's a Republican. I guess I'm a Republican. My sister's a Republican. We're all Republicans. And it may be that kind of a thing where if you've got a lot of Republicans, it's like, I guess I am. I don't know. I don't actually think about politics much, and I don't think about these policies very much, and I guess I'll just be whatever's easiest, and I'll go vote. And if somebody appeals to me that made a cool commercial, maybe I'll go for that. It's possible that's why you see some of that spread. You do see a big group of unaffiliateds in Utah that are very liberal, and we think that is a similar thing. It's like, I'm not a freaking Democrat. No. I mean, what are you going to go to Beaver, Utah, and find a bunch of Democrats there? You're not. But maybe it's like, you know what? I don't feel like I totally agree with the Republican Party on some of these issues, and so I'm going to just be unaffiliated. And and that's because maybe they actually agree a lot more with the more liberal, more traditionally democratic principles quite often than the other. I don't know where that sense. That sense just kind of fizzled out. So apologize for that. Anyway, I think that's super interesting. So in addition to those two first reports, we also have all these briefs that we're releasing. In fact, we released one yesterday that I was fixing this morning, which is why I got up here all sweaty. I was riding up the hill fast because I was late to get up here because we were fixing one, and we're going to release another one tomorrow. We release these things all the time. It feels like we're up to, I think tomorrow it's the 14th maybe. But we've got a bunch of briefs that talk about each of the issues. So, which the slide that I used was brown lawns. So if you look at the water issue, we have a water brief. You find that data point in the water brief. So we delve into that. Beyond the priorities, we look at some other questions and some other things to really kind of understand the issues. We also released something just a few weeks ago that's called On the Ballot. We did this first back in 2020. It's about the constitutional amendments. How many of you are registered to vote? All right, a lot of people are registered to vote. You're going to have 4 constitutional amendments on the ballot. If you haven't been paying attention, you'll find out that 2 of them you'll be like, I'm going to vote for or against all these things. 2 of them aren't going to count because of some shenanigans in part from the Speaker of the House and the President of the Senate. I shouldn't say shenanigans. I mean, it is. It was a big mistake. They made a big mistake on one of these ballot initiatives, and which is why. And this is actually the one from 2020. I don't have the new one on this slide, but pretty interesting stuff. You understand the issues a little bit from a nonpartisan perspective. I mean, if I was talking to the sponsors, the pros and cons for each of those A and D ballot initiatives, which are the controversial ones, both people would throw stuff at me from both sides, opposing and I mean, it's just silly. The conversation around both of those is absolutely silly. We get by the silliness and talk about the issues and talk about them in a very dry-eyed perspective. It's not as exciting, but effectively one of the things we say is that yeah. Anyway, it's not as exciting as the stone throwers on these issues, but there are a couple other ballot initiatives that are kind of interesting. Particularly, one of them. I mean, one of them's not. I mean, I don't know. One of them's just not, but one of them is, and there's that's going to count. So read our On the Ballot report. It's super fascinating, and like I said, I think we've got 3 more reports out, and then we've got those research briefs, and then we've got 1 more report out. This is going to be fascinating. You listen to somebody like, this is all interesting. I can't pick and choose. They're like it's like my babies. I've got the Priorities Project. I've got like 21 babies, and I love them all the same. But the last full research report that actually, the last time we did this, it affected a change in government. We vote differently now because of Utah Foundation research related to delegates. So we've got a report coming out that shows how delegates are the same or different than voters in terms of priorities and across these issues. It's super fascinating stuff. Hopefully that's going to be out before the end of November. But like I said, we've got so many things that we're releasing that we'll see. Anyway, you guys are awesome. Any questions? I think that you're probably like, it's time to go, man. There's only 4 minutes left until 1.
Please, if you have questions, feel free to ask them now.
Yeah.
Oh, I got it.
Okay.
Yeah.
What kind of steps when it comes to taking the surveys are you taking to ensure that your population is diverse enough, that you're not getting like one economic sector or income sector?
Yeah, so survey work is so much harder than it used to be. And honestly, I want it to always be totally accurate and want it to always reflect the population. And it will never again. Probably. I mean, it's really hard. But the step you take, you try very hard to get a very diverse group of people in a variety of ways. And then when you realize this doesn't look like the state, then you weight the data so that, like, if you took the survey, your voice would be, you would probably be like 2 people, whereas if I took the survey, my count would be like 0.75 people, just because I'm more likely. My dad is like 0.5 person. My old people are probably more likely to be like, oh, I've got some time here, and whereas as younger people are like, this is a stupid survey. This is probably a scam. I've been scammed before. I don't know. So but it is tricky. But we weight the data based upon race and ethnicity, gender, age. I think the guy that weighted them should be here to answer that. He'd punch me because one of those is probably wrong, and we probably included something else. I think those are the ones. Those are the ones they usually use. Yeah. That's what we use. 90% sure. So we work hard to do it. But it's it's like, don't look too closely at it, Sean. Like I mean, because it's probably not perfect, just like polls are probably not perfect. And they're like, you do as much as you can. And when you see something that's a red flag, it's like, why is this? And you can look more carefully at it and see if there was a problem. But yeah, you do what you can to make sure it's reflective. Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Do you guys have like a newsletter?
Oh, yeah. So if you you can, there's a little QR code. I mean, our website's actually pretty easy. It's utahfoundation.org, and you can sign up to for the newsletter at the bottom of the site. We release that typically about once a week or so. And right now we've got so much stuff coming out. We don't, like, not everything even makes it in there because we've got a lot of content coming out. Yeah.
When you do the questions on policy proposal, how does your data compare with like the actual voter data? Like, do you guys collect stuff on like the constitutional amendments and stuff? And like, how does your data compare with the actual voting data?
So in terms of like, are we asking questions that are actual policies that are being proposed? No. So is that right? Yeah. So for this survey, those are like that. Think about water. They're not actually. I mean, the thing about $500 for education. I mean, nobody's going to do that in a million years. I mean, the legislature's not like, yeah, let's spend a whole ton more money. I don't know how much money is that. I don't know how much money that is. It's $1 billion. So that's unlikely to happen. But all that said, we just purchased a bunch of voter records and non-voter records to ask people questions that are policy proposals to see where they're at, and we're going to be doing some panels to get feedback on these mini surveys over in 2025. So we'll have more of that going on. We'll know more about specific policies that are being talked about as they're being talked about, like during the legislative session and other times. So keep an eye out for that. I think that should be pretty interesting. We're actually doing a little bit of fundraising for that right now, and we're setting all that up, and so we'll be ready to roll with some of those questions.